And a very warm welcome. You're joining us here at Hyde Park on Other Derana 24. Tonight, we will be talking about Sri Lanka's economic policy, regardless of who comes to power. We have a presidential election declared for the 21st of September, and two candidates have already declared and launched their election manifestos. Of course, a number of areas have been discussed and addressed in these manifestos, but the highest number of candidates in Sri Lanka's electoral history are contesting and have placed their nominations for the presidential election 2024. To discuss the economic policy most suited for Sri Lanka, what Sri Lanka's new leader should focus on, and what areas have been missed out in these election manifestos, or what other candidates too can talk about. We've invited to discuss with us virtually Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar, Senior Lecturer of the Department of Sociology of the University of Jaffna, who's joining us virtually tonight. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Kadirgamar.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, Dr. Kadirgamar, a contributor to international publications related to Sri Lanka's political economy and editorial committee member of the Sri Lanka Journal of Social Sciences and a number of committees as well. Dr. Kadirgamar, as I mentioned, we are talking about Sri Lanka's economic policy and how we should move forward. Two candidates have already published their election manifestos, but a number of others, the highest number of candidates this time around. So what should be our economic policy going forward, to begin there?
Yeah, first of all, we have to contextualize the current situation. This is the worst economic crisis that Sri Lanka is going through since independence, and perhaps even earlier, probably since the Great Depression of the 1930s. So what policies we decide to take forward is going to have a great impact on our future. This is the kind of crisis that affects generations. It will have intergenerational impact. And therefore, even at this stage, 2 years into this very deep economic crisis, the kind of economic policies that we take forward are critical. And then with these elections, as we try to elect a new government, regardless of which government comes to power, what kind of policies will they take forward, both at the macro level, policies at the regional level, policies relating to our macroeconomic fundamentals, relating to trade, to finance, but also policies relating, for example, to food security and education and healthcare and social welfare. So this is a critical moment in terms of the kind of broad economic and social policies that the country needs to take up. Clearly, the country needs to shift direction because there is tremendous amount of suffering among the people. Poverty, even according to the data, has more than doubled. It's above 25%, it's probably much higher. According to the UNDP, something like 55% of our population is multidimensionally vulnerable. That means they are indebted, they're not eating enough, there's malnutrition, there's school dropouts. So this is the situation in which we definitely need to change course and find some amount of economic stability, because regardless, this is going to be a long drawn-out crisis. This is not something that we're going to come out in a year or two. In my view, this crisis is probably still going to last another 5-10 years, and survival is critical. And the real question is whether any new government that comes to power is capable of addressing the situation. Definitely, the current government, past governments have failed. But what kind of policies are we going to take forward? And I would say our economic policies have to now focus on the basics of survival. So we have to ensure health, education, food security, social protection are priorities. On the macro level, Sri Lanka is not the only country going through this kind of crisis. Close to 72 countries in the global south, 72 developing countries are in debt distress. Close to a dozen countries, like Sri Lanka, have already defaulted on their external debt, and they're trying to restructure their debt in some form. So these are also very difficult times globally. Global trade is declining. We are seeing wars in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, the war in Gaza, tensions in the South China Sea. There's increasing polarization, which is also not favorable for Sri Lanka's recovery. It is in this kind of a situation that we have to think about our economic policies.
Dr. Kadirgamar, you did mention that this is a critical situation. Past governments have failed, present government has failed. Do you think our candidates, all these candidates who are pledging to create a better future for our people, for our country, really understand the current grave situation as you explain?
My sense is at the current moment, all the candidates are only thinking of coming to power. They have not made their strategy or the way in which they can come out of this economic crisis clear enough. There have been some ideas that they have put forward, but they certainly haven't mobilized the people to face the kind of long drawn-out crisis that our country is going to face. So regardless of who is elected, on day one, when they come to power, they're going to face very serious challenges. And unless they can then gather the country together and to move forward systematically addressing these problems, it's going to be very difficult times. I can give you an example. 2 months ago, there were huge uprisings in Kenya. Now, the government of Kenya was elected about a year and a half ago with a fairly large majority. But before that government was elected, a year and a half before that, they went into an IMF program, and they continued with that IMF program, imposing huge amount of austerity and suffering on the people. And that triggered 2 months ago huge protests when the government tried to increase taxes and bring about a new finance bill, where the government had to even withdraw that bill. And there were very powerful calls for the resignation of their president. This is the kind of scenario that Sri Lanka is looking at. We've been in an IMF program for over a year now. And the IMF program itself has created another crisis, a social crisis. And unless the government that comes to power has the political will and the courage to renegotiate that IMF program, there will be continuous suffering, and the people won't go along with it. There will definitely be opposition, because if people are starving, if people don't have food, if there's malnutrition, what's the point of an IMF agreement? What's the point of saying that there is economic recovery? So I would say the first major question when it comes to economic policies among any new president and government is what they plan to do with this IMF agreement. Now, they have said that they will renegotiate it, particularly the two leading parties, SJB and NPP. They have said that they will renegotiate the IMF agreement, but on what terms will they renegotiate it is the big question.
Dr. Kadirgamar, when you say the IMF program should be renegotiated, are you saying that this program has not been struck, the deal has not been struck in the advantage of Sri Lanka, in the best interest of Sri Lanka? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I would say that President Ranil Wickremesinghe and the SLPP government, they just went along with the IMF without even negotiating what they could have negotiated in the interests of the country. Let me give you an example. Sri Lanka, after 2027, according to the IMF's debt sustainability analysis, is going to have to pay the equivalent of 4.5% of our GDP in external debt servicing. That is external debt principal and interest payments. Every year, 4.5% of our GDP is going to be paid to our creditors. Our economic growth is only going to be 3.1%. Or to put it another way, this 4.5% of GDP, according to the IMF model itself, is going to be the equivalent of 30% of our revenue. In other words, the government has been raising taxes. They have increased the value-added tax to 18%. Where is all that going to go? To pay the creditors, the bilateral agencies, but even more, these very powerful bondholders.
But how do you say,
Dr.
Kadirgamar, sorry to interrupt, but how do you say, Dr. Kadirgamar, that this situation could have been renegotiated in a better way to secure a better deal for Sri Lanka, given the situation, given the kind of crisis that we plunged into? Sri Lanka was in a grave situation at the time. And as we understand, negotiations continued for months and more than a year. And creditor committee negotiations continued for a longer time. So do you think there were better, and how do you think these better agreements could have been signed, and what areas do you think we could have focused on?
The problem is that the IMF, its interests are aligned with the creditors. The biggest shareholder in the IMF is the United States and Western countries, and they serve their own interests. The bondholders, the big hedge funds who are located in New York and London. So it is for us to negotiate hard in terms of our own interests. Now, people say the IMF agreement is a bailout. That is a complete lie, for the reason that the total IMF program is only $3 billion US. And this $3 billion US will be dispersed to Sri Lanka over a 4-year period. Now, what does that mean? In other words, every month, that is equivalent to just $60 million US. There is no bailout. How is the Sri Lankan economy surviving right now? Currently, on the average, every month, our foreign earnings are $1,800 million US. That is 30 times the amount of the IMF agreement. So we are not dependent on the IMF funds here to run the economy. We are running on our own earnings. How are we earning that? We are earning by the hard labor of our women. Women working in the garment sector, women working in the tea plantations, many women who have now gone as domestic workers under horrible conditions in the Middle East. It is their earnings that we are using to purchase our essential items, including fuel, including milk powder. So there was no IMF bailout. Even if that negotiations dragged on a little longer, that wouldn't have made a difference in terms of the macroeconomic situation of the country. But President Wickremesinghe and the SLPP government that he leads, they wanted to rush through this IMF agreement to show that there was somehow some kind of a success. But there's no success here. Look at what's happened to poverty, the amount of suffering that our people are going through. And then worse, they wanted to rush through this debt restructuring deal with our creditors. Who are our biggest creditors? They are the bondholders. And this is not just unique to Sri Lanka. How did we get trapped in this kind of debt, commercial debt? Before 2007, about 15 years ago, we did not float any sovereign bonds, international sovereign bonds as they're called. But from 2007, the first one for 500 million US dollars, and then 2009, part by part, we started floating large amounts of sovereign debt. Why did that happen? Because as you know, in 2008, from 2007 to 2009, there was the global financial crisis. The Western countries went through a financial crisis, so their central banks reduced the interest rates close to zero. The Federal Reserve in the United States reduced their interest rates down to zero. When they did that, all of these bondholders, they came and pushed all this debt into the emerging markets, on Sri Lanka, on Ghana, on Zambia, so many countries. And while interest rates there were close to zero, this is foreign exchange debt, dollar debt. We were paying something like 7-8% interest. Now think about it, over a 10-year period, if you take a loan for 7.5%, the interest payment at the end of 10 years is going to be equivalent to your principal if you do the compound interest math. So that is how we got indebted. And that is why at this current moment, it's not just Sri Lanka. Ghana has defaulted, Zambia has defaulted, Suriname has defaulted, Ethiopia is in severe debt crisis. So many countries around the world. Look at what is happening to Bangladesh. It's falling apart. So this is a structural problem. And all these countries were in IMF programs all along. This is our 17th IMF program. In 2009, we went into our 15th IMF program, and they encouraged us to go and borrow like this and get into a debt trap. In 2016, we went into an IMF program. They did a debt sustainability analysis then as well. Why did they not see this crisis coming? And now we're in an IMF program. What is the end goal of this IMF program? If you read the IMF report, which is part of the IMF agreement, which was brought out in March 2023, it's publicly available. Their goal is that in 2027, Sri Lanka will float another 1.5 billion US dollar sovereign bond. In 2028, another 1.5 billion US dollar sovereign bond. So this is just a recipe for us to continue into this debt trap. So we absolutely have to renegotiate. We have to think about self-sufficiency. This idea that somehow we can borrow at such high interest rates and grow is a myth. And this is a myth not just for Sri Lanka. This has been the case for so many countries in the global south. So we need a completely different economic policy trajectory. Now, there's one important concern. Unlike other countries, in 2022, this is the first time we have defaulted on our debt. And the current global financial architecture gives a huge amount of power to the IMF. The bilateral creditors, excluding China, what's called the Paris Club, they insist on an IMF program for them to restructure their debt. So the IMF has a hold on us this time. They are imposing all this austerity. They are imposing policies that are extremely favorable to the Western world, claiming that they will help us restructure our debt. But as I mentioned earlier, that restructuring, if we are to pay 30% of our revenues, or it's also the equivalent of about 30% of our exports every year from 2027 onwards for debt servicing, what is most likely going to happen, what has happened to so many African countries, so many Latin American countries, is that with all this suffering, we might default again. We might go into a cycle of repeated crisis. But that's been the history of the IMF. They are used to that. And that serves the interests of very powerful Western countries.
Are
So
you
we have
saying,
to chart.
sorry to interrupt again, Dr. Kadirgamar. Are you saying that you're warning of another default for Sri Lanka if in 2027 we are unable to pay that? Are you saying we cannot put our policy right to spur economic growth and enable Sri Lanka to have the sufficient the dollar earnings to service our debt, to honor our commitments to the international creditors and bondholders and the IMF itself?
That's right, because unless there is a large reduction in our debt stock, we won't be able to repay all that debt. Even the IMF debt sustainability analysis, which is again in the report that I mentioned, even they say that after this debt restructuring process in 2027, Sri Lanka's total debt is going to be 95% of GDP. So one shock will again push us into debt distress. Look at the global situation. We talk about somehow exporting our way out of this crisis. But this is not the 1990s when global trade growth was 3 times global GDP growth. Now, global trade growth is actually lower than global GDP growth, which means it's a shrinking pie. We are going to be competing with every country, all the other countries that defaulted like us, all the other developing countries, and the successful countries. What are they trying to do? They are trying to increase their exports. So there is no guarantee that we are going to be able to beat all of them. This is the reality. So one, we have to renegotiate the IMF agreement and say that this is impossible. We are not willing to take the risk of defaulting again, that we are not willing to put our people through so much suffering that an entire generation is lost, that we are going to first safeguard our society. Second, we have to renegotiate with our creditors to say they have already made a killing out of our debt. As I mentioned, from 2007, these bondholders, for all the bonds that we repaid, they have made more than double their investment in interest. So now it's time for them to drastically reduce our debt stock. Otherwise, we have to say, sorry, we won't be able to repay it.
But will that look good for Sri Lanka? Will that look good for Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka's borrowing ability, especially honoring our agreements with these bondholders and creditors. It was Sri Lanka who borrowed, and we have entered agreements with these bilateral creditors and private creditors as well. Will that be good for Sri Lanka's image globally, and especially given our requirement to borrow significantly in the future as well?
So these are issues that we have to think about. We can think about our image in Western financial centers, or we can think about the survival of our people. 1. 2, everybody knows now enough about these bondholders. They are like loan sharks, right? As I mentioned, they have made more than 100% out of countries like Sri Lanka. And when we say we are going to borrow again, what are they going to do? They're going to extract more. We can never get returns from our economy on that scale. In fact, definitely, I would say we should never return to the bond markets. That's a recipe for disaster. That's how we got into this default. We went through a 26-year-long civil war and we did not default on our debt. Why did we default now? Because 15 years ago, we decided to go to these commercial markets, to these bondholders who extracted so much from us. So definitely, we need different kind of development financing that would work for us. Borrowing in these bond markets is just not going to work for a country like Sri Lanka. And that's where the IMF, where are they directing us? They are directing us right back to the bondholders who were the cause of this crisis. As I mentioned, in 2027 and again in 2028 already, they want us to float sovereign bonds. Why? And then we can use those sovereign bonds to repay more of this debt of the creditors.
I do
We need a
understand your
completely different strategy.
I do understand your point here, Dr. Kadirgamar, but I'm also trying to understand your view here on what Sri Lanka could have done differently. When we plunged into a situation of severe debt where we could not manage the debt, where we could not service this, the debt repayments as well as feed our own people, what could Sri Lanka have done differently other than going to the IMF? Of course, the government that prevailed previous to the crisis, it was the same government, but the former president used to say that Sri Lanka will look at a homegrown solution. However, Sri Lanka was unable to figure that out within our own means. What, in your view, could Sri Lanka have done differently?
Yes, first of all, if you look at Sri Lanka historically, what it has done, since 1977, we opened up our economy. We decided to allow everything to be imported. We were not producing anything. And how did we pay for those imports? We started borrowing. So we have to really think about production, and we have to think about self-sufficiency in important sectors. So that started as far back as 1977. Then we went into this borrowing binge in 2009 onwards. And successive governments have been responsible for that. It's not just the Rajapaksas. When Ranil Wickremesinghe was prime minister under the Sirisena Wickremesinghe government, they even borrowed more. It is that accumulated debt. Even in my writings, by 2013, 2014, I was writing that we are headed towards a debt crisis, that you can't borrow at these high interest rates and repay. It was a matter of time. The COVID crisis and the war in Ukraine pushed us over the cliff. But sooner or later, we were going through default because you cannot borrow so much at such high interest rates and expect it to be sustainable. The second major issue is that throughout that period, we were borrowing all this money. Look at the number of BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes in Colombo. It was not used for investment. All this foreign currency, all these hard-earned foreign earnings of our working people were spent on luxuries. They were not invested to produce growth. We opened up imports. That is what every successive government did until the crisis. By 2022, it was in many ways too late. What could we have done then? Or what could we have even done in the months leading up to the default? We could have drastically restricted our imports. Even now, currently, the latest IMF statement says that they're welcoming a change of policy to import vehicles. Our fuel consumption, people can't even afford public transport. Our fuel consumption has come down by 40%. That is a sign of how weak the economy is. But they want to resume automobile imports. So two things. We have to be very careful about what we borrow, how we borrow, and what we use that borrowing for. Two, we have to focus on trade. We cannot just live beyond our means by importing everything. So we need to change that. Now, there was the way in which we've handled this crisis since 2022, as I mentioned, is not through the IMF agreement. The funds from the IMF are peanuts. It's by restricting our imports and paying for it with our hard-earned foreign earnings. That's the sustainable path. We have to increase our local production. And I would start with an emphasis on food. I do research on fisheries. I'll give you an example what's happened to fisheries. We are an island nation. We have huge marine resources. In the 2010s, we were exporting $250 million of seafood every year. But during the 2010s, we were also importing anywhere between $200 and $250 million of seafood. Why is an island nation importing so much seafood? And the seafood that we imported is dry fish, moldy fish, which ordinary people use. Now, what's happened since the economic crisis? Because of the IMF policy of market pricing energy and kerosene prices went up, our production of fish, our availability of fish has come down by 30 to 40%. Our per capita consumption of seafood, that is, each individual on the average, how much seafood they consume, compared to 2015, it was 31 kilograms per year. In 2023, it has dropped down to 19 kilograms per year. And 60 to 70% of our people's animal protein depends on seafood. Obviously, there's a malnutrition crisis. But if we don't encourage local production and focus on food, we are going to lose another generation. So there needs to be a drastic change in this kind of economic policy.
Right.
But the IMF doesn't want that. The IMF does not want a change in economic policy because that won't serve Western interests. What does the West want us to do? Even in this hard economic crisis, they would still like us to import BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes. That's why the European Union, in every one of their statements, keeps saying, lift your import restrictions. But if you're going to go along the West and abandon our people, or are we going to start thinking about the interests of our people? And that is the big question before our presidential candidates.
Dr. Kadirgamar, I think it's time we take a very quick commercial break here at Hyde Park. We've been talking about, Dr. Kadirgamar mentioned health, social protection, trade, food security and education, as well as trade and manufacturing industries and production. Local production is key areas to be focused on going forward. We'll return after this short break for more. Welcome back. You're joining us here at Hyde Park on Derana 24. We were in conversation with Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar, senior lecturer at the University of Jaffna, who's talking about Sri Lanka's economic policy that's best suited for Sri Lanka beyond 2024 and to arrest the current economic situation. Dr. Kadirgamar, I'd like to move on to also talk about some of the key areas that you focused on: education, trade, policy for local production, as well as health and how Sri Lanka can survive the rest of the 5-10 years that you call are critical and needs to be addressed with diligent efforts of policy and other measures taken locally.
Yeah, we could, start with what our most vulnerable population needs. If you look at Sri Lanka's economy, anywhere between 60 to 70% of our people are in the informal sector. In other words, they don't get a regular monthly income. they're almost dependent on their livelihoods on a day-to-day level. And it's their food security, it's their children's education, it's their healthcare that is of prime importance if this country is going to move forward. So I would say there has to be a focus on ensuring, first of all, that there's enough food in the country, because from time to time in the world market, there can be a food crisis, prices can drastically increase, or there can be shortages. So we need to use the current situation to put a much greater focus on the production of food. In other words, agriculture, fisheries, and livestock.
Are you saying we haven't
Because
focused on production of food and agriculture yet?
we have not, because since 1977, when we took on the open economy policies, they just thought we can always import food. So there was no real investment in agriculture to be able to increase production, to ensure that people can get a decent livelihood out of it. So this is not investment in high tech. This is not investment in large industries. This is investment in the rural economy, but we can also invest in agricultural industries so that our local resources are used to create greater value even out of food. Now, of course, the government can say, we don't have any funds right now, we cannot invest. So we have to prioritize this. But the one thing that the government or the state has is control over land. Now, in my research in the rural areas, I've found that even with this economic crisis, if people have 2-3 acres of agricultural land, then they can somehow survive. They will get some kind of a regular income from agriculture production. They will also get their own food. So one thing that the government can definitely do, even if it doesn't have large amount of finances, is that it can provide land or redistribute land.
Do you think we have the technological know-how and the kind of machinery and the modern technologies required for us to develop our agriculture industries?
This is the issue, because when it comes to agriculture, fisheries, Sri Lanka has small-scale producers. They are making a living out of it. This is not, I'm not talking about a scenario where we suddenly become this export-oriented miracle. Let's leave myths aside and miracles aside, because we are in a very serious, deep situation. We have to take stock of our reality, which is about survival. And I'm talking about how 60 to 70% of our people are going to survive. It is through basic agriculture and fisheries so that they can produce a share of their food and also supply food to others. But that still requires some investment. Small irrigation channels have to be made, marketing centers have to be created, there has to be transport facilities to be able to ship all this food. We have to change the built environment in a way that we support small-scale producers. This is not the time to create big agribusinesses, which would actually take away the livelihoods of so many of our rural people. What are they going to do? There are no jobs in the country. Let's be frank about this. When the World Bank says people are not productive in agriculture and let's get them off the land, are there any jobs in the cities? With the economic crisis, and not only the economic crisis, the IMF's recommendation to increase interest rates, our central bank did a very disastrous move. They increased interest rates from 6% to 16.5%, the central bank's policy rate in 2022, which meant commercial lending went up to 29%. So many small and medium enterprises collapsed. Just in 2022 and 2023, 500,000 formal sector jobs were lost. So there are no jobs. So how are we going to feed these people? What kind of livelihoods?
You mentioned social protection as well. So how do we look at that? I'm trying to speed up the conversation also because we have a number of areas to discuss and very little time here on our show. So Dr. Kadirgamar, social protection. You mentioned that two manifestos have been presented. One, to continue the current social protection. The others say no, there will be additions made. But of course, people need a lot of attention. How do you look at this?
Definitely, because not everybody can raise themselves through these kinds of livelihoods. There are disabled people, there are older people, there are women-headed households who don't have any resources. For them, social protection is critical. And in the IMF program, they are only looking at a target of 0.6% of GDP for social protection. As I mentioned, 4.5% to repay debt, but only 0.6% of GDP for social protection. That's why we are seeing so much suffering. They need to drastically increase that amount. What did they do with even people's retirement funds? There was domestic debt restructuring last year. And according to my calculations, the retirement funds of working people, EPF and ETF, are going to reduce by almost 50%, by 47% over the next 16 years. So even the people who retire, their retirement funds are going to be much less. We need to change that. In other words, we can float other bonds and redress this huge injustice to our working people. People who earn below minimum wages, like plantation workers, their EPF is going to be reduced by 50% over the next 16 years. So, and while all that is happening, there has to be social protection. The worst thing you can do during a crisis, and this is exactly what the government did, is to change the system of social protection. They went from Samudhi overnight into Asvesma, which was a disaster. What you want to do is you want to strengthen the system. You don't try to change a social protection system when everybody needs it most. That was again a recommendation of the IMF, and the World Bank designed it, and you would have seen the protests, how unsuccessful it has been and the kind of disruptions it has caused. So we need a very strong, and I would say a universal social protection system, because you can't target during a crisis like this. One day the farmer has no income. The next day the fisherman doesn't have an income. Our economy is very seasonal. So how do you target? Just because somebody has a bicycle, they don't need social protection? That's ridiculous. So you need a universal social protection. And this is where there's a difference between external debt and domestic debt. External debt is in US dollars. We need foreign earnings to be able to repay it. Domestic debt is in Sri Lankan rupees. In a crisis, every country increases its domestic debt to be able to address the suffering of the people. And that is what one thing we need to do. And the next thing is, where do we get the revenues? Taxes. Now, during an economic crisis, the incomes of everyone is declining. And income is a flow. An income is a flow that flows every year. So it's very hard to tax that when everybody's income is shrinking. But wealth is a stock. What we have seen in Sri Lanka over the last few decades is that inequality has increased, the wealthy have become much more wealthy, and the poor have become much more poor. So we have to have a wealth tax on that stock of wealth and redistribute it, invest it for the kind of rural development that I mentioned. So it has to be a combination, social protection for anyone who needs it, at the same time ensuring our survival through rural development and food as the first basis. And then, of course, in parallel, we should try to increase our exports, but it's going to be a very difficult environment if you look at the global situation.
Right.
Even the World Trade Organization's predictions about global trade growth is very dismal. So it's going to be very hard to export our way out.
Dr. Kadirgamar, I'm told we only have a couple of minutes on the show. You write extensively on the political economy, Sri Lanka's situation, welfare, and how the economy could be transformed. if you look at, if we try to be optimistic of Sri Lanka's way out of this crisis and a better future for our people, for the younger generation as well, what do you advise going forward as a key policy measure to be taken by either of these candidates?
Now, as I mentioned, this is the worst economic crisis since the 1930s. We went through a similar crisis like that in the 1930s. Like the COVID crisis now, there was the malaria crisis and 2% of our population died. There's mass starvation. What did we do? We should learn from our own history. That is when we decided to bring about free education, free healthcare, and a universal food subsidy. We need to think like that. Out of a crisis, we have to dramatically change direction, and we have to think about our youth and our next generation. We have to invest in them. This is not about having high levels of economic growth. People benefit from it. There's also the danger. We know what happened in the 1930s. In many countries, even fascism came about. It can be a time of great polarization. They can turn the communities against each other. So there's a huge challenge before the next government, both politically, to ensure there's coexistence, that people don't find scapegoats and start fighting among each other, and at the same time, completely changing our policy direction so that we survive for the next 10 years and keep our high human development indicators. That has always been the strength of Sri Lanka, not high economic growth. It's high literacy, high levels of human life expectancy, the food situation. So we need to focus on our basics and then focus on our youth, make sure that they get their education, their skills, their nutrition. And that is the way to move forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kadirgamar, for your time here at Hyde Park, joining us virtually from Jaffna. You explained to us about Sri Lanka's way out of this crisis and what, importantly, our candidates vying for the presidential election should consider. So thank you once again for your time here.
Thank you for having me.
And we will in discussion with Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar, Senior Lecturer at the Department of Sociology of the University of Jaffna, a contributor to international publications regarding Sri Lanka's political economy and involved in a number of research-led work on Sri Lanka's development goals. We'll see you again next week at the same time with yet another discussion here at Hyde Park on Other Derana 24. Have a pleasant evening.